"Not this table, Caroline," Preston Vale whispered. But the billionaire had already stopped in front of the poorest man in the diner. Outside, a Vermont snowstorm pressed its white hands against the windows, shaking the glass with little bursts of wind. Inside Miller's Corner Diner, forks paused halfway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered in the air, and the old television above the pie case was still showing Caroline Whitaker's face beneath the headline. "Billionaire philanthropist arrives for tonight's charity gala." She stood there in a camel-colored coat darkened by melted snow, her hair loosened by the weather, her eyes tired in a way money could not hide. At the last booth, beneath a flickering yellow lamp, Ethan Miller sat with his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie, sharing one plate of pancakes cut carefully into equal pieces. His jacket was worn at the cuffs. Her mittens did not match. Between them sat 2 glasses of water and one small bowl of syrup, stretched thin like everything else in their life. Caroline looked at the empty seat across from them, then at Ethan, and asked softly, "Can I sit with you?" The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Preston stepped closer, lowering his voice as if kindness were a public relations mistake. "Caroline, there is a private room in the back. The press is outside. This is not the image we discussed." Ethan looked up slowly. He did not recognize her as power. He did not see the net worth, the cameras, the foundations, or the polished name the rest of the country repeated with admiration. He saw a woman standing alone in wet shoes, trying not to look lonely. "It is just a chair," he said. Sophie immediately slid out of the booth and pulled the seat open with both hands. "You can sit here. My mom used to say lonely people should never eat by themselves." Caroline blinked. For one fragile second, the famous woman who had spoken in front of senators, investors, and stadiums looked as if a child had touched an old bruise in her heart. She sat down carefully, as though the vinyl booth were more sacred than the velvet chairs waiting for her at the gala. The waitress behind the counter, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, stopped wiping the same coffee stain she had been wiping for 10 minutes. A truck driver near the door leaned back. 2 teenagers quit whispering. Even the grill seemed quieter, the soft hiss of butter fading under the weight of something no one could name. Ethan pushed the syrup a little closer to Caroline. "We only ordered 1 plate," he said, calm and unashamed. "But there is enough if nobody minds smaller bites." Preston gave a thin laugh. "Mister, do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" Ethan took a breath, then handed Sophie the better half of the pancake. "A hungry person," he said. "That is usually enough information." Caroline looked down at the pancake, then at the man across from her. His hands were rough from work, marked with flour near the knuckles, but there was a steadiness in them that reminded her of letters she had kept hidden for years, letters from a stranger who once signed only 2 initials. E.M. She had come to this town looking for the person who saved her when she was a forgotten 12-year-old girl with failing eyesight and no family able to pay the bills. She had searched records, church basements, old scholarship files, and burned archives. She had followed the last clue to this diner without knowing why. Now, across from her, Ethan Miller smiled gently at his daughter and broke his own piece of pancake in half again. Caroline did not know it yet, but the man the room was quietly judging was the reason she could see the world clearly at all. Caroline reached for the fork Ethan offered her, but before she could take a bite, the bell above the diner door rang again, and a cold wind slipped through the room like an unwanted opinion. Ethan rose without drama, walked to the entrance, and pushed the door shut with his shoulder. A small, elderly man outside had been trying to pull his coat tighter against the snow, his boots sinking into the slush near the curb. Ethan glanced at him, then at the nearly empty tip jar by the register. He did not sigh. He did not announce anything. He simply took the last $5 bill from his pocket, folded it once, and tucked it into Mrs. Brooks's hand. "Bowl of soup for Mr. Harlan," he said quietly. "Put it on mine." Mrs. Brooks looked at him with the tired sadness of someone who had watched him give away money he needed. "Ethan, you already worked a double." "Then I earned enough to share," he said. Sophie watched from the booth, her chin resting in both hands, proud and worried at the same time. Caroline saw that look. It was the look of a child who knew her father was good, and also knew goodness did not always pay the electric bill. Ethan returned to the table, brushed snow from one sleeve, and sat as if nothing had happened. Preston studied him with narrow eyes. "You make a habit of feeding strangers?" Ethan poured a little syrup on Sophie's side of the plate. "Only when they are hungry." That is not a financial plan, Preston said. Ethan smiled faintly. No, it is just a human one. The words settled over the booth with quiet weight. The yellow light above them flickered again, catching the fine lines near Ethan's eyes, the small burn mark on his wrist from the grill, the wedding band he still wore on a chain beneath his shirt, because some promises did not leave when people did. He had lived in that town long enough for people to think they knew him. They knew he drove an old blue pickup with one rusted fender. They knew he rented the small apartment above the laundromat on Maple Street. They knew he packed Sophie's lunch in brown paper bags and walked her to school when the truck would not start. What they did not know was that every month, even in the lean months, Ethan mailed a small envelope to a scholarship office that had changed names 3 times in 10 years. Sometimes it held $40, sometimes $12. Once, after Sophie had the flu and the heating bill came high, it held only 4 $1 bills and a note that said, "For someone who needs tomorrow." He never signed his full name. Only E.M. Sophie had asked him once why they helped children they would never meet. It had been late October, the first frost silvering the laundromat windows, and Ethan had been counting quarters on the kitchen table. Because your mother believed one child helped at the right time could grow up and become a miracle for someone else, he had told her. Sophie had considered that seriously, then pushed 3 coins from her own jar toward him. "Then send these too," she whispered. "Maybe somebody needs a little miracle." Now, across from Caroline Whitaker, that same child tore her napkin into a tiny paper heart and placed it beside Caroline's coffee cup. Caroline stared at it, as if it were something expensive, something rare, something no boardroom had ever given her. "Your daughter is very kind," she said. Ethan looked at Sophie, and the tiredness in his face softened into grace. "She had a good teacher," he said. "Her mother?" Caroline asked gently. Ethan nodded once. "And life. Life teaches, if you let it make you tender instead of hard." Preston shifted impatiently, checking his phone, already measuring the damage this strange little dinner might do to Caroline's image. But Caroline was no longer listening to him. She was watching Ethan lift his glass of water and quietly give Sophie the last bite of pancake, as if dignity were not something a man claimed, but something he practiced when no one important was supposed to be watching. Caroline held the paper heart between her fingers, and for a moment, the diner disappeared around its fragile edges. The voices at the counter blurred. The storm pressed harder against the glass. Somewhere behind her, the television replayed clips of her foundation, her speeches, her smiling face beside governors and schoolchildren. But the woman in the booth did not feel like that woman tonight. She felt 12 again, sitting under a cracked church basement window in northern New York, pretending she could still read the chalkboard when the letters had begun to swim and vanish. Back then, her name had not opened doors. Back then, Caroline Whitaker had owned 2 sweaters, 1 pair of shoes with cardboard in the soles, and a fear so large she carried it like a second backpack. "You okay?" Ethan asked gently. Caroline looked up too fast. "Yes," she said. "I was just thinking." Preston gave a polished little smile. "Caroline does a great deal of thinking. That is why half the country wants 5 minutes of her time." Ethan did not take the bait. "Must get lonely," he said. Preston laughed under his breath. "Lonely? She owns buildings in 6 states. Sophie tilted her head. "Buildings do not talk to you when you are sad." Caroline looked at the child, and the truth of that simple sentence landed harder than any compliment she had heard that year. She set the paper heart beside her cup and folded both hands around the warm ceramic, not because she was cold anymore, but because she needed something steady. The real reason she had come to Maple Falls had not been the gala, not the cameras, not the ribbon cutting at the new learning center. Those were useful reasons, respectable reasons, the kind Preston could schedule and explain. The real reason was hidden in a leather folder inside her hotel room, beneath contracts and donor lists. 8 letters, 9 old receipts, 1 black and white photograph clipped from a local newspaper nearly 22 years ago. A girl with thick glasses standing outside St. Agnes Children's Home, smiling shyly beside a nurse after an eye surgery no one had expected her to receive. Across the bottom of the first receipt were 2 initials written in blue ink, E.M. No full name. No address that still existed. Just monthly payments, sometimes small, sometimes strangely precise, as if the donor had given whatever was left after groceries, rent, and life had taken their share. The letters had come with the money. Not long letters, Not sentimental ones. Just enough words to keep a frightened girl from giving up. You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see. Caroline had built an empire on education technology, but before she had investors, before she had awards, before she became a woman people stood up for when she entered a room, she had those letters. They had followed her through foster homes, community college, late-night jobs, and the first company she built out of a rented room with bad heat and borrowed chairs. She had hired investigators quietly. She had searched church records. She had traced the old scholarship fund to a fire, a merger, a storage unit, and finally to a handwritten ledger that mentioned Maple Falls. Now she sat in the last booth of a small diner, watching a tired single father wipe a drop of syrup from his daughter's sleeve with the corner of his napkin. His name was Ethan Miller. E.M. The initials brushed against her mind like a match near paper, but she pushed the thought away because it seemed too impossible, too humble, too close. The man she had imagined had always been older, richer, perhaps a retired doctor or a quiet attorney with money to spare. Not this man with worn cuffs, gentle eyes, and a dinner he kept making smaller so everyone else could have enough. What brought you to town? Ethan asked. Caroline opened her mouth, and for the first time in years, the practiced answer would not come. She looked at Sophie's paper heart, then at the storm beyond the window. I am looking for someone, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Someone lost. Caroline's voice softened. No. Someone who found me first. The words stayed between them like a candle flame no one wanted to disturb. Someone who found me first. Ethan looked at Caroline with a kind of stillness that did not pry. He had learned long ago that people carried locked rooms inside them, and love was not kicking the door open. Love was waiting on the porch with a warm meal until they were ready. Then I hope you find them, he said. Caroline studied his face, searching for recognition, some flicker of guilt or pride, but there was only quiet kindness. Preston slipped his phone into his coat pocket and leaned forward. Caroline, the mayor is already at the event. The press pool has been waiting 20 minutes. We cannot build a national education campaign around you eating diner pancakes with strangers. Sophie frowned at him. We are not strangers anymore. Preston gave her the kind of smile adults use when they want children to feel small. That is sweet, sweetheart, but Miss Whitaker has responsibilities. Ethan's eyes lifted, calm but firmer now. Her name is Caroline at this table. For the first time all evening, Preston had no quick reply. The old clock above the counter ticked loudly. Snow slid down the window in wet sheets. Mrs. Brooks poured coffee for a man who had already paid, then quietly filled a second cup for the man who had not. Caroline felt the tiny structure of her. Public life shifting, not collapsing, just loosening. Titles had always protected her. Schedules had shielded her. Money had built rooms where no one could come too close. Yet here, in a booth with cracked red vinyl and a napkin dispenser that leaned slightly to the left, a little girl had called her by her name, and a tired father had defended that name without wanting anything in return. Do you draw often? Caroline asked Sophie, nodding toward the sketchbook beside the plate. Sophie brightened. Every day? Dad says drawing is how quiet people talk. Ethan smiled faintly. She talks plenty without it. Daddy, that was not a complaint. Sophie opened the sketchbook with careful pride, turning past pages of snowmen, school buses, a brown dog with wings, and her mother drawn as a star above a small apartment building. Then she stopped at a page Caroline was not ready for. It showed a grand room filled with people in fancy clothes. Every chair was full except one. At the edge of the room stood a woman in a long coat, her face turned away, her hands folded in front of her, as if she had forgotten how to ask for anything. At the top, in uneven pencil, Sophie had written, "The lady with no table." Caroline's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "Why did you draw her?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Sophie shrugged, suddenly shy. "I saw you on television last week. Everybody was clapping, but you looked like nobody was sitting with you." Preston shifted, uncomfortable. "That is an imaginative interpretation." Ethan did not look at him. He looked at Caroline. Children notice what adults edit out. The sentence reached her so gently that it hurt. Caroline had spent years being admired in crowded rooms, yet no one had noticed the empty chair beside her. Not the investors, not the politicians, not the reporters who praised her vision, but a child in a diner booth had seen it through a television screen. For a moment, Caroline could not speak. She turned one page back and saw another drawing, smaller and unfinished. A man holding an umbrella over two children, though rain soaked his own shoulders. Beneath it, Sophie had written, "Daddy helping again." "He does that a lot?" Caroline asked. Sophie nodded proudly. "He says if your hands are full, you can still make room in your heart." Ethan cleared his throat softly. "Sophie, people do not need my whole philosophy with dessert. But it is true. Truth still needs manners." Caroline laughed then, not the polished laugh she gave donors, but something surprised and human. It broke through the tension like sunlight through a dirty window. Even Ethan smiled. Even Mrs. Brooks glanced over with wet eyes. Preston, however, looked toward the front window where two local photographers had gathered beneath an awning, their cameras angled toward the booth. His face hardened, and Caroline saw it. The calculation. The fear of an unscripted image. The belief that a poor man's table could stain a billionaire's brand. But Caroline was no longer afraid of being seen there. She looked at Sophie's drawing again, at the lonely woman with no table, and quietly slid it closer to her heart. "May I keep this?" she asked. Sophie glanced at Ethan for permission, and he nodded. "Only if you promise to sit at a table next time," Sophie said. Caroline looked across at Ethan, then around the diner, where silence had softened into attention. "I think," she said, "I just did." Preston saw the photographers lift their cameras, and something in him snapped into motion, not loud at first, not obvious, but smooth and practiced, the way a man moves when he believes every human moment must be managed before it becomes a headline. He stepped beside the booth and placed one hand lightly on the back of Caroline's seat. "Enough," he said, still smiling for the windows. "This has been a touching little pause, but we are done here." Caroline looked up at him. "I decide when I am done." "No," Preston said, his voice dropping lower. "The foundation decides. The board decides. The donors waiting at the hotel decide. You are the face of a national campaign, not a woman collecting sad stories in a snowstorm." The diner changed at that. A spoon clicked against a plate. Someone near the counter muttered under his breath. Ethan slowly folded his napkin and set it beside the empty pancake plate. "You can speak to me any way you want," he said calmly. "But you do not need to speak over her." Preston turned to him fully now, all politeness thinning into contempt. "And who are you exactly?" Sophie stiffened. Ethan did not. "I am her father," he said, nodding towards Sophie. "That is the only title I need tonight." Preston laughed once, too sharp. "Of course. A noble single father. A worn jacket. A cute child with drawings. Forgive me if I have seen this script before." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Preston." But he was already performing for the room, for the cameras outside, for the invisible audience he imagined would understand his caution. Men like this know how to position themselves. They sit close to sympathy. They offer pancakes. They say humble things. Then a week later, there is a fundraiser, a medical bill, a GoFundMe, a quiet request for help. The words landed like sleet. Cold. Small. Mean enough to sting, but polished enough to pretend they were practical. Sophie's face flushed red. "My dad does not ask people for money." Preston looked down at her. "Sweetheart, adults are complicated." Ethan's hand moved gently across the table, covering Sophie's little fist before anger could teach her the wrong lesson. "Let it go," he whispered. "But he is lying." "I know." "Then say something." Ethan looked at Preston, then at Caroline, then at the people pretending not to listen. The grill hissed behind the counter. Wind rattled the old diner sign outside. The yellow lamp above the booth hummed like it was trying to hold the piece together. "Everyone has a sad story," Ethan said at last. "Not everyone uses it to buy kindness. And not everyone who looks poor is trying to sell pain." A few eyes dropped. Mrs. Brooks stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. Caroline's breathing had changed. She had heard wealthy men insult competitors, reporters twist motives, board members reduce children to numbers in a quarterly report, but this was different. Preston was not attacking a strategy. He was attacking dignity. And Ethan, somehow, refused to hand his dignity over. Preston leaned closer. "Then prove me wrong. Tell us why you are really sitting here with her." Ethan's answer came without heat. "Because she asked." That was all. No defense. No plea. No wound displayed for applause. Just the truth, simple enough to shame the complicated. Caroline felt something rise in her chest. Something older than anger and softer than pride. She looked at Ethan's worn cuffs, at Sophie's trembling mouth, at the half-empty syrup bowl between them, and she understood that the poorest thing at that table was not money. It was Preston's imagination. He could not imagine goodness without a hidden invoice. He could not imagine a chair offered without a trap beneath it. Then the diner door opened again, and two photographers stepped inside, shaking snow from their coats. One of them raised a camera. "Miss Whitaker, is this part of tonight's charity event?" Preston straightened immediately, recovering his smile. "Just a brief community moment," he said. "Nothing official." But Sophie slipped from the booth before Ethan could stop her. She stood beside her father, small in her mismatched mittens, eyes bright with tears she refused to drop. "It is official to me," she said. "He feeds people when nobody is taking pictures." The first flash went off, white and sudden. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, not from fear, but from the old tiredness of being seen only when someone needed a story. Caroline stood then, slowly, carefully, with Sophie's drawing pressed against her coat. She did not look at the cameras. She looked at Ethan, and in the hush that followed, she began to wonder whether the person she had crossed the country to find had been sitting in front of her all along. The second camera flash never came, because Ethan lifted one hand, not toward the photographers, not in anger, but in quiet refusal. "Please," he said, "not my daughter." Something in his voice made even the men with cameras lower their hands. Caroline turned toward them with the kind of calm that could quiet a boardroom. "No more pictures." Preston's smile tightened. "Caroline, that is not wise. It is not a request." The photographers stepped back, embarrassed by the softness of her authority. For a few seconds, only the storm spoke, scraping snow along the glass and pushing cold air through. "The old window seams." Sophie wiped her cheek with the back of one mitten, then looked at her father with a fierce little sadness. "They always think you want something," she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her. "People think what they know how to think. But they do not know you. That is all right." "No, it is not." Before he could stop her, Sophie pulled away and ran toward the narrow hallway beside the restrooms, where a back staircase led to the small apartment above the laundromat next door. "Sophie," Ethan called, but she was already gone, her boots thudding up the steps like a tiny heartbeat refusing to be ignored. Mrs. Brooks set down the coffee pot. "She is going for the box," she murmured. Ethan looked at her, and the color left his face. "Evelyn, no." Caroline heard the change in his voice. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. The ache of a man whose private kindness was about to be dragged into public light. Preston noticed it too, and for the first time, his certainty flickered. "What box?" he asked. No one answered. The diner waited. A minute passed, then another. The old clock ticked above the counter. A plow rumbled somewhere down Main Street. Caroline stood beside the booth, Sophie's drawing pressed against her coat, feeling the strange nearness of the past. Then Sophie came back down the hallway carrying a dented blue tin box with painted daisies on the lid. She held it with both arms as if it were heavy, though it could not have weighed more than 3 pounds. Ethan stepped toward her. "Sweetheart, that is not for this." Sophie hugged the box tighter. "Mom said truth is for when lies get too loud." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Caroline saw grief there, and love, and surrender. Sophie placed the box on the table. The metal made a small hollow sound against the worn surface. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were folded receipts, old envelopes, church bulletins, and copies of letters wrapped in a faded ribbon. At the very top was a photograph clipped from a newspaper, yellowed at the edges. Caroline's breath caught. She knew that photograph. A thin 12-year-old girl with thick glasses, standing outside St. Agnes Children's Home after surgery, smiling like hope was something she had just been handed and did not yet trust. Caroline reached toward it, then stopped, as if touching it might break the years between then and now. Ethan spoke softly. "Sophie, put it away." "No," she said, crying now. "He said you wanted money. He said you were pretending." "You do not pretend." Preston leaned in, his voice losing its polish. "What is all this?" Mrs. Brooks answered from behind the counter, her eyes wet. "It is what he never wanted anyone to see." Caroline picked up one of the letters. The paper was old, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting moved through her like a song remembered in a dark room. "You are not alone. Keep reading. The world will need what you see." At the bottom were 2 initials. E.M. Her hands began to shake. She opened another receipt. The donor line said Ethan Miller. The amount was $27.43. The date was from the winter she had almost dropped out of school because she could not afford new lenses. Caroline looked at Ethan. He looked away, not ashamed of giving, but humbled by being found. "It was you," she whispered. Ethan's voice was barely louder than the snow tapping the windows. "It was never supposed to be about me." The room went completely still. Even Preston did not speak. Caroline held the letter to her chest, and the billionaire who owned towers, companies, and headlines stood in a small-town diner with tears in her eyes, staring at the poor single father who had been carrying her future in a blue tin box for years. Caroline did not say another word in the diner after that. She simply folded the old letter with hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts without shaking, placed it carefully inside her coat, and looked